Everybody's awful these days. It's enough to make everyone crazy.
Sounds like the Joker's right there. And in this episode, we're talking about Joaquin Phoenix. This is Alex from Los Angeles.
And this is Karan from San Francisco. Welcome to Movies That Shaped Us. We're two longtime friends who grew up on opposite ends of the globe with very different backgrounds, but we're both shaped and are still being shaped by the movies we see and love. In this episode, we'll cover a filmmaker who shaped our love of film. And like Alex mentioned, it's the one and only Joaquin Phoenix. So, Alex, yeah, talk to us about your relationship with Joaquin, what he means to you, and what kind of caught your eye the very first time with him.
Yeah, I mean, I'd seen him in his early career in a couple movies, but he was not an actor that I necessarily would have gravitated towards or would remember in some of those early 90s performances. I mainly even just knew him of the brother of River Phoenix, who was
Mm-hmm.
an up and coming actor in the 80s and early 90s and tragically died young. I was aware of River. And at the time, actually, in the 90s, when I started kind of getting into film in high school, I just was associating Joaquin with, oh, he's just River's brother. Like I wasn't thinking about him as his own actor. And it really wasn't until Gladiator and his performance in that film as Emperor Commodus that I really was like, wow, this guy is electric screen presence, just very odd and interesting. Like he's not just playing like a normal way this villain role could be played. There's a sort of a traditional boring, for lack of a better word, way you could play that character. But he is the energy and the interesting thing in that film. Like Russell Crowe is incredible in the film, but he's playing more of a classic kind of leading man, kind of unemotional a performance that is still amazing. And I love him in the movie. But Maximus is just a very typical performance. Whereas what Joaquin's with Commodus was interesting. I was like, oh, this is interesting. This is an actor that I want to now start paying attention to. And then he definitely became a lot more famous in the years since then. And then Walk the Line too really was a huge standout for me. I'm a big Johnny Cash fan. I thought he did an incredible job capturing Johnny Cash, and then the fact that he was singing and playing guitar. I mean, it shows that he just really dives into the role deep. And so the role kind of
Mm-hmm.
envelops him, which I think is definitely, and we'll get into his different phases later. But that's what I think I find him so fascinating now, because he really does become one with the role and chooses very interesting parts with a lot of top tier filmmakers when they're doing more experimental kind of outside of the box things. And I think he brings to his performance is something a little more experimental and outside the box as well. And, you know, the reason why we're focusing on Joaquin, not only because we both like him as an actor, but he's in the new Ridley Scott epic, Napoleon, playing, I think, one of the more interesting historical figures of all time and complicated figures, Napoleon. And we have not seen the film yet, so we won't be able to
Mm-hmm.
talk about what he does there. But I'm definitely very interested, not only in the film, because I'm a huge Ridley Scott fan and a huge personal fan of Napoleon the Man and what he did, but also how Joaquin is going to capture the essence of who Napoleon was. I'm definitely excited because of him. And I think that, again, speaks to his talent as an actor of doing things that are interesting and unexpected. That's why I'm like, I don't know how he's going to do this. He could do this in many different ways, but what is Joaquin going to do? And I think that's actually one of the things that attracted Ridley to want to do that project with Joaquin. So, what about you? What is your history with Joaquin Phoenix?
Yeah, very similar to you. I think Gladiator is what I saw him first in and was sort of blown away by his magnetic but odd but creepy and sinister. But at the same time, you sort of also root for him
Yeah, you
presence
do. Yeah,
in a
good point.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And just even his face with the scar, and I mean he's a I would say he is a good-looking guy, but
Hmm.
he's not conventionally good looking at all. It's sort of kind of odd in all aspects. And since then I've sort of followed his career, I would say quite a bit. And yeah, like you said, the words unpredictable and interesting always come to my mind.
Hmm.
And I was thinking about it before we started recording that he is probably the modern day De Niro, Daniel Day-Lewis sort of actor
Mm.
that we think
Mm.
of now, like somebody who really, immerses himself in a role. Every Joaquin movie, the audience knows he's going to take you somewhere. And
Uh-huh.
there are not many such actors, who can do that, but more importantly, who can do that and be box office draws. Kind of
Right.
how De Niro and all were, right? Like you wanted to show up for a De Niro performance or even a Pacino performance. So he is definitely of that ilk. In fact, I would argue the only one of that ilk in our times today for the last decade or so. But having said that, he is a leading man, but not a conventional leading man. Because those
Hmm.
guys, De Niro and Daniel Day Lewis, they could play the conventional leading man part as well.
Right.
Joaquin, I'm sure if he wanted to, he could, but he doesn't.
Hmm.
And there's something very interesting that makes him probably just uniquely positioned in the history of movies, who is a character actor, but with a leading man draw without
Hmm.
actually playing leading man characters.
Right. The
Which,
typical,
yeah,
right. A typical good looking kind of leading man
right.
role. He just hasn't, at least that I can come up with the top of my head, hasn't really done that. And I think he could
Yeah.
pull that off. And he is good looking enough where, you put him in the right kind of outfit. He'll
Yeah. I
be
mean,
that
Her
matinee
is the
idol.
closest we come to seeing him, in like but even that's an odd movie in a good way. But he is, at least playing a conventionally good looking, average sort of person.
Mm. Yeah, but
But
still a weird, and we'll
yeah,
get into that, a
yeah,
quirky film and a definitely very interesting character who falls in love
totally.
with an AI. But yeah, I mean that is probably the only closest he's come so far, at least in his
Right.
career, of trying to do that. But I think he could decide to, and we'll get into that in a little bit in the phase. I think there were opportunities where he could have jumped for that, but the fact that he didn't, I think, speaks a lot to what he wants to do as an artist. When he had the sort of blank check to do whatever he wanted, he decided to go more and more out there and extreme in his oddity and just interesting projects that he does, because he knows he's a box office draw, so he can lend his his name, and then the fact that there will be hopefully some audience behind it to push the audience then of people that like him to into more interesting projects and just sort of weird films.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, I feel like his oddity and his choices are what the draw is. And
Yeah.
people want to see where he's going to go next, which
Hmm.
I can't imagine anybody else, let alone now or at any point in time, has had that kind of appeal, which
Yeah.
is kind of amazing.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
So with that, let's get into his filmography. So if listeners haven't heard these episodes yet, where we kind of go into the careers of our favorite filmmakers, actors, directors, writers, what we do is we look back over their career and divide them into distinct phases where we feel the artist was doing something in one phase and then transitions to another. So with Joaquin, I feel like his first phase was from his screen debut up until Gladiator. And in this phase, I think a lot of it, like I mentioned earlier, he had a very famous brother who was also an actor and definitely the leading man, matinee idol, really good looking guy.
Mhm.
I think was on a path to do those more conventional roles you mentioned. Unfortunately, tragically, his life was cut short. So in
Mhm.
this stage, I think he was definitely overshadowed a bit by his brother and choosing interesting roles, but they were more supporting roles. They were not necessarily leading roles. He maybe was co-starring at best, but the movies were not living or dying on what Joaquin was doing. But I think here was maybe just, again, getting his acting chops, trying to make his name from self outside of the shadow of his brother. And this phase of his career too, I've seen several of these films like U-Turn, 8 mm, but I don't necessarily remember his performances in them very much, to have him standing out of much to be like, oh yeah, no, I remember what Joaquin was doing. I think maybe again he was just sort of paying his dues or just trying to get exposure, but not necessarily finding a lot of success at this point. What about you? What is your experience with these films early in his career?
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of these movies except for To Die For, which I think is very emblematic of sort of how we see Joaquin now,
Uh-huh.
where this character that he plays is kind of dark, kind of quirky, kind of childlike in some ways, that you root for him. At the same time, he's not a good guy, has a very odd, unnerving presence, but
Hmm.
you also kind of scared for him. So it's so funny to me. I watched To Die For maybe a couple of years ago. It was on Criterion, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is sort of what Joaquin has become now as a grown-up. So
Oh, interesting.
kudos to Gus Van Sant to cast him, and he's amazing as just like I think he's just in his teen years, but it's such a lived in kind of effortless performance, which can easily be super over the top.
Uh-huh.
I think that's sort of the other thing which we should mention, that Joaquin makes interesting choices and did with this movie and continues to make, but he's never over the top, I would
Mm.
argue. Or
Hmm.
maybe sometimes the material demands it to be, or the director demands it to be, but he's not playing it, just for the heck of it. So I don't know.
Hmm.
This is one performance that I always remember of his. That's kind of an early kind of foretelling of what would happen.
Yeah, that's interesting that again, I've not seen that film, so I can't talk about that film specifically, but it's interesting that he was there was something there that obviously Gus Van Sant saw. He's again
Yeah.
a director who's very good at sort of casting actors. I find and getting great performances
Yeah.
out of them. But interesting that he saw something in Joaquin that maybe Joaquin didn't even realize or know until then. He had the size of his career, was able to really exploit those uniqueness about what he does, those special Joaquin things that are standing out amongst other actors. So moving on then to his second phase, which starts with Gladiator and really goes through a lot of more mainstream Hollywood fare up until the Walk the Line, which is the Johnny Cash film. I think this is really the time when, because of Off of Gladiator, which again is a performance that I don't want to say he steals the movie, because again, I think Russell does a great job as Maximus, but he's definitely the most interesting character in that.
Totally.
Flamboyant. But like you said, you do feel for him. There is a sympathy to this this guy who is always kind of belittled by his father, never really shown any respect, and then his father decides to pass him over for the job of basically leading Rome and giving it to Maximus as general. So there's definitely a feeling of a jilted son who never really got what he wanted, and that explains a lot of why he acts a lot like a child and sort of is who he is. And you do feel for him, even though again he is the villain of the picture and he does a lot of bad things here, that he's not sympathetic, but you do have some empathy, and I think that is credit to Joaquin for sure. Any just before we move on from Gladiator, I think it's such a seminal work for him. Any other thoughts you have on his performance in this film?
Just his presence, like the oddity of it. Like we keep using that word again, but there's like vulnerability to him as well, and then also like this is a period epic movie,
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't associate period epics with Joaquin, because most of his movies are so centered and grounded around him. So it's sort of fun to see him in this larger than life canvas and holding his own in period costume and kind of looking the part, Like I don't think of him as like a physically transformatory actor. I think of him more as an internal transformational kind of actor. So it's kind of fun to see him in that light as well.
No, I definitely agree. And then I think this role, because it gets him so much acclaim, and obviously this is a huge hit film that wins Best Picture, he parlays that into his mainstream success, I will call it. And this phase, he is doing a lot of more traditional Hollywood blockbusters. He worked with M. Night Shyamalan, who at the time, I mean, even though he's still a name today, I mean, he was a major filmmaker whose films would be huge hits. Signs was a film that he did, Joaquin did with him too, was also one of the biggest movies of the year. And then The Village. And these performances, I think he's bringing interesting things to them. I'm not a huge M. Night fan. I'm not a big fan of either of these movies per se, but Joaquin, these are more traditional roles that I think he's doing in them, but there is something interesting to them where there is a vulnerability and an empathy that you feel for these characters, even in these more kind of mainstream roles. And that is something I think that is unique to what Joaquin does. He also, again, is very conventional, like Ladder 49, just a fireman movie. I mean, he's I think realizing he has success and he's trying to see how far he can stretch his persona, but he's still within that box of 4-quadrant sort of popcorn Hollywood films, which, Gladiator is too, to a certain extent, right, even though it's a master work, but it still is at the end of the day, like a Sword and Sandals action epic. So anything else kind of jump out here before we get into Walk the Line, which I think is a very important film for him?
Nothing really more than just I'm happy that he has kind of this blockbustery career, because it's fun for, when actors are, their artistic ambition is meeting commercial ambition that often doesn't happen. And especially for an actor like Joaquin, who sort of marches to his own drumbeat, I'm happy that he had this phase of commercial, broader appeal, international appeal, because, these movies, especially the M. Night ones, they are international successes, right? In their own right. So they helped his career to then, I would say, elevate him to this latest phase that he's been on since Walk the Line.
Yeah, no, and actually, as I look through these films too, he was never the star. The movie didn't live or die based on him. Right. He's there with Mel Gibson. He's in an ensemble. He's with John Travolta. Like, he's with other box office draws, but I think that gives him the box office credibility to be able to be cast in a film like Walk the Line, where it really does. I mean, it's a biopic of Johnny Cash. He is Johnny Cash in the film. Like, this film would not work without him. He's right there in the poster with Reese, who was also a big star at the time. So it is a co-lead, but he is the titular character. He's the one walking the line. He's Johnny Cash. And I think, again, as someone who is a big fan of Johnny Cash and his music, Joaquin really does get lost in this part. He does a fantastic job of portraying, the complexities of not only who Johnny Cash was, but, his relationship with his wife, who Reese Witherspoon plays. The fact that I remember being so surprised at this at the time, that he's going to learn the music and sing the songs. Like, it either goes really poorly, or goes well. I mean, the only other person I can think of that kind of succeeded in this was Val Kilmer with the Doors. Like, he was able to sing those Jim Morrison songs, and you sort of forget that it's an actor singing. And in this movie too, you forget this is Joaquin singing these songs. You think it's Johnny Cash. And I think this is a perfect crystallization of his mainstream success, but bringing his dedication to these parts and trying to do something more interesting with the role of Johnny Cash. And this film, I really like this film a lot. I think it's a great music biopic that typically those can fall into some of a box and be kind of samey and boring. But I think Joaquin's performance, and Reese too, I want to give her a lot of credit as well, because it's about their relationship, but he really elevates this picture. What do you think about Walk the Line?
Yeah, I love this movie too. I watched it actually fairly recently and was just blown away again by the music. And I would say this couldn't have been a more perfect movie for Joaquin to take on. Because if you think about it, it has all the machinations of, a tortured person who has like a lot of internal kind of struggle and trauma. At the same time, he's magnetic, that people are drawn to him. He's very good at what he does, his art, in this case, music, but there's a vulnerability and sadness to him as well, which is always teetering at the border of becoming aggressive or dangerous. That to me is Joaquin's persona. And I think all those elements are in Johnny Cash. And on top of it, it's fully internalized. There's music. The scope of the film is amazing. The relationship between him and her is so fully realized that there couldn't have been a better vehicle, I think, to kind of catapult Joaquin into the stratosphere. That, okay, this is now a mainstream leading actor, coming from the ranks of a character actor-y kind of person, being in a few blockbuster ensemble movies, and here he is. And then, this is sort of the beginning of the phase that we are still in, which is incredible because Walk the Line was in 2005.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's been 20 years almost.
No, yeah, it is crazy. And I think this movie, because it was a box office success, sort of it's a mainstream film. He's on the poster, but then also he's nominated for Best Actor. So this second phase starts with his nomination for supporting actor for Gladiator, and then ends with his leading nomination for this. I think now finally he has the box office clout and also the critical bona fides to really go off and do some very interesting, weird, quirky things, which I think his entire rest of his career since this movie, which has been now 15 years essentially, has been trying, I'll say it, weird projects that probably have no guarantee of mainstream success, but he now has that mainstream clout to try to bring an audience to these movies that are very odd and a bit off. And I will, mention that I've not seen this film, but there was I'll call it like a fake, it was a fake documentary, essentially, that he made called I'm Still Here. Came out in 2010, but he worked on this for a while with Casey Affleck. And it was essentially a performance he would do out in the real world, in press interviews and things, that he was going to quit acting. He grew his hair out. He had a big beard. He's like, I don't want to be an actor. I'm going to be a rapper now. And it was kind of like a performance art piece, because he kept this gag up for over a year in the press. He'd be on like David Letterman and all these shows and be like, what is going on? And you believe that, okay, he's some kind of weird guy now. Maybe this is what he wants to do after his Walk the Line success. He's going to become a rapper now. And it was all for the sake of this documentary, but and the documentary did not do well. Again, I haven't seen it, but I think this definitely cemented in my mind of like, oh, this guy is like really wants to take artistic chances, so much so that he's going to pretend his entire life is changing for a whole year with the press and all these interviews. It was definitely more method than method. I mean, he became this character version of himself, and it's like a performance art piece. And I think that speaks to going to an extreme for him of like, I'm just going to do something so out there and so weird. And yeah, audiences actually didn't show up and the movie didn't do well and apparently wasn't very good. But I think that to me was like, wow, this guy is pushing himself. I want to follow his career now. I'm like, what else is he going to do? Like, even though this might not have worked, he's going to do a lot of interesting things. And it leads to, performances in Her and The Master, Inherent Vice, that these are working with like top tier talent with Spike Jonze and Anderson, but these are very interesting and off kilter and quirky roles that he just does a fantastic job in. And I don't know if you want to speak to anything else from this period so far that stands out before then. And we should probably touch on the Joker at some point, even though I don't like the film. But yeah, what are your thoughts on this phase of him just really stretching himself?
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying earlier, like this is how we know Joaquin as, and I think this is how Joaquin would be known in the history books, as this daring actor who takes chances. And I think a lot of it, to your point, has to do with his collaboration with really interesting directors. You mentioned too, the third one in there, James Gray. I love
Yes.
a lot of these collaborations, like The Immigrant, We Own the Night, both very, very good movies, not perfect, flawed in their own ways, but they're artistic chances for sure. And I think it's critical. The PTA collaboration, I think, is probably the one that stands out the most in my mind. All of his collaborations, like without PTA, I don't know if Joaquin is where he's at today, the way we know him and the way we love him. Because I think PTA really gets him to unleash everything that Joaquin has to offer. I mean, we covered The Master about a year ago on this podcast. It's one of the most unnerving movie experiences I've ever had. And I think it's, the more I watch that movie, the more I'm like this is probably the most unhinged performance, which is inside out and outside in, to the point that the man walks in a way that is just, a brutal manifestation of his troubles and his suffering right in his body. Like that's the level of immersion we are talking about, and PTA got him to that place, which is why it's so pivotal. And then I think Her is a very special one for me, because I think after seeing Joaquin all these really intense, dark movies, with massive trauma, to see him in this lighter, mild-mannered kind of form where he's dressed in pastels and has a smile on his face, this kind of mustache, and this whole world of slightly in the future LA. Yes, he's falling in love with AI, which is now even more relevant than before.
Right.
So there's a trick, of course. It's a Joaquin movie. It's not going to be a straightforward rom-com, obviously, but there's something very sweet about him, and I love that somebody came in and pulled out that vulnerable side of him and kind of made that the centerpiece, because he's always had that. But it's usually surrounded with a lot of darkness and trauma and trouble. Here it's about just vulnerability and sadness and love. So I love that this is a movie that's nestled in this chapter.
Yeah, that's interesting on Her. It's a movie I love as well. And I'm sort of surprised it's never come up in this podcast before, honestly. Maybe it will in a future episode. Yeah. But I think this role of this kind of socially awkward guy who ends up choosing to fall in love with an AI versus these real women in his life that he's not really treating very well, in the wrong hands, could come across as a very unsympathetic character who's kind of a creep and a weirdo. You're like, this guy's just weird. Like he's not fitting in. He's too socially awkward. But Joaquin, again, has this, much like with Commodus too, even though he's playing like a villainous emperor, you have a lot of empathy for his performance. And there is a sweetness in it, and you relate and you understand, and you don't look at him as like this weird guy. Like, why is he talking to this machine? Like, he should get out there and be with real women. It's like, oh, you totally understand where he's coming from. And there's a lot of heartbreak at the end when, the machine leaves him and you do feel really bad for him. And then he's starting to get human connection again. And I think there's that empathy that he brings into this performance. Like he does all of his even weird, quirkier performances. They're never to your point you were making earlier, too like showy and sort of so much so that like you're like, this is just some weird guy. He's like, okay, this is a weird role. It's a weird performance, just weird. No, there's some kind of empathy that grounds you in his performance that I think it's
Although
great.
I will say in this movie, I never questioned that, because it is set in a slightly futuristic world, right? So this is a very real
True.
possibility. So there's nothing like the movie sells that pretty clearly that, yeah, okay, sure, this is happening. I will say that I think this movie is critical because if you remove this movie out, like I was saying earlier, all the other ones are kind of these dark, out there kind of
Mm,
movies. And I think this movie presents to us as an audience the range of Joaquin
hmm
to see that, oh yeah, he's not just the guy who's going to come and shake you up. Like he can also do sweet and
mm.
strained and such. So I think it's sort of, even though this, I think he was nominated, I'm quite sure, for this movie.
He wasn't. No, he wasn't.
Oh,
He
which
was
is too
nominated for The
bad.
Master, but not for
Right,
this one.
not
Yeah.
for this, which is a bummer. But I think it's pivotal in us and the industry recognizing him that, okay, this guy can do sort of anything.
hmm Right. And I think actually the final film I think that we need to discuss is The Joker. And it's a film I don't like actually, and I don't think really works. But now that we're talking through his entire career, I actually think it is the representative of who Joaquin is an actor. So it
100%.
is a movie that was a gigantic financial success, huge hit. So he has the box office. It's a very showy performance that could be a little over the top. See Jared Leto if you want to know what an over the top version of the Joker is. It doesn't work, but there is an empathy to this character who is a bad guy, but not really. And it's a really weird performance. Like his body is very thin and odd, and how he moves his body in this movie is also very interesting and weird and off-putting, but you still have empathy and sympathy for his version of the Joker that I don't think really any other actor could have pulled off this version of what they were trying to do with the Joker character. And so it really does encompass everything we just talked about in his entire filmography. All the phases all work together in this performance that ended up winning him the Academy Award. He finally
I
got it.
couldn't agree more. I think this is the perfect encapsulation, and I'm glad, despite our feelings about the movie as a whole, it makes sense to me that this is the movie he has, or this is the performance he has an Oscar for.
Yes.
This
Yes.
makes sense to me. And it's undeniable. I will never forget the experience of watching this movie. Dread and fear and all of it throughout, but yet a lot of empathy and sadness sort of for him and in general and such. So it's pretty incredible. There are a few other movies in this chapter which,
Mm-hmm.
are swings and some land and some don't. Like I thought The Irrational Man is actually quite interesting. You Were Never Really Here is very hard hitting and very brutal, where this guy
Mm.
is basically going around killing people with like a hammer, literally, like beats them down with a hammer.
Oh,
Oh, I didn't mean to say Irrational Man. That's the Woody Allen movie. That's not good.
yes. Oh, it's not good. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not good. Sorry.
Yeah,
There's
okay.
another. Oh, I meant to say, don't worry, he won't get far on foot. That's
Oh,
the
okay.
one Gus Van Sant movie, which I think is actually quite charming. But yeah, some of these work, some of these don't work, but he's always good in them, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
except for Irrational Man, which is just bad across the board.
Okay. Thanks for that correction there, because I've not seen that. So like, oh man, it's good, even though I'm
No.
not a Woody Allen guy. But okay, and then obviously we had not seen Napoleon yet, so we don't know how he's able to capture this very complicated historical figure. So what we do at the end of these episodes is just talk about what we would hope the actor will do in the future. So what do you want to see next in Joaquin's career?
I think I kind of what we were saying a little bit earlier about the vulnerability aspect of his, and that if he wanted, he could have done like a leading man role,
Mm-hmm.
I would love for him to do that, like work with someone like an Alexander Payne, perhaps, and
Mm-hmm.
make like a sweet kind of romantic comedy of sorts, but like real life. I'm
Mm-hmm.
almost thinking of, we've covered a few James L. Brooks movies. I would love to see him in that kind of a tone, which is real enough, but there's still comedy and lightness to it,
Mm-hmm.
or like a sweeping romance where he's portrayed as a slightly older but like debonair, good-looking guy. We've never seen him in that sort of dashing, debonair kind of light, and I think he can do that. I would love to see him in like a stylized kind of modern day romance of sorts.
Yeah, so I was thinking something very, very similar. Of I wish now that he has stretched himself, if he went back to a more mainstream film and just try to do a leading man role and did that interestingly. Because he's done leading men the last phase of his career, but they've always been in sort of unconventional films. I think the Joker's the closest one to a conventional film just because it's based on, the Batman IP, even though the film itself was, R-rated. It's not a comic book movie in any way other than just based on the characters. But yeah, I'd love to see him in that type of, like, similar to like a Walk the Line, where it was in a way like a romantic lead, because it was a romance. But to go back to a movie like that as an older actor who has now this entire phase of these more experimental films and credits to his name, just what he could do would be fascinating, I think. And also just a comedy would be interesting, like a full on, like, out and out kind of more slapstick type. I think he could do that type of thing, a very broad comedy, but adding a lot of very interesting things to it. I think that'd be fun to see him do.
Yeah, I totally agree. We didn't mention two other movies, by the way, Beau is Afraid and Come On, Come On, which I have not seen Beau is Afraid yet. At some point I probably will, but yeah, it'll be good for him to step outside of those, because even those two are sort of like, yeah, her like vulnerable in Come On, Come On, and then Beau is Afraid, pushing all the eccentricities and out there stuff to the absolute extreme limits. Like, I feel like he's kind of stuck is the wrong word, but sort of in that mold, and it has been now for a while. It'll be good to kind of change that up a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, Beau is Afraid, a film I've not yet seen either. I think from what I've gathered, there are a lot of sort of broad comedic elements to that too. So but obviously that's a very unconventional, very quirky film that is not an easy watch from what I've heard. So it would be interesting to see him step into more of a comedy, but take those abilities into a more sort of like straightforward, maybe even romantic comedy. That'd be interesting to see. Definitely interesting to see what he would do there.
Well, hope you enjoyed this discussion on Joaquin, and hopefully you all are excited about Napoleon just the way we are as well to see. As always, we are available on all podcast platforms, including YouTube. Please rate and review us, and don't forget to subscribe, as all of that really helps listeners find us. So with that, we'll see you next time.
See ya. Am I not merciful?